Okay, tax time again. What's it going to cost me this year? Well, that seems high. That's a lot more than I thought. Is everyone this expensive? Here's a local company. Let's check them out. They've been around for 15 years. Average fee less than $79. I'm going to Tax 29. They have an office near me. What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to Discovering His Story, where we attempt to look at the biblical record and connect it with the secular historical record that we find. We've been looking at ancient times, which is the period from the beginning of time up until not too long before the time of Christ. And in that period, we're looking specifically at ancient Egypt. And we're seeing a lot of connections between what happens in Egypt and what is happening in the Bible, because there's a lot of people in the Bible going to Egypt. We saw last time Abram going to Egypt, and then we saw Joseph and his arrival in Egypt as well. The last time we were together, we were looking at the rule of Hatshepsut. Now, if you did not see the previous broadcast, I suggest you stop right now, go to the archives and look at last week's program, because without it, you might be a bit confused. And this, in fact, even watching it, you might be a bit confused. I don't know. But hopefully, that'll help clear things up as we proceed. We're looking at the time when Moses has been born into an Egyptian family, and he was found in the Nile River as his mother put him there in that basket, floating in the Nile. And I believe that the woman, the princess that found him, was named Hatshepsut. We saw how Hatshepsut had to help out with the ruling of Egypt because her stepbrother / husband was mentally not quite with it. And then when he died, his son, which would be her stepson / nephew, was too young. And so Hatshepsut gradually took over total control, so that when Thutmose III, that stepson / nephew, came of age, Hatshepsut did not give up her rule, but continued to exercise authority, which of course incensed Thutmose III. Now, we were looking at the temple of Hatshepsut last time, so we'll take another quick look here. We mentioned that Horus, represented as a falcon, is guarding the entrance to the temple. And at the temple itself, we find a number of statues of Hatshepsut herself posing as Pharaoh with the fake beard and everything. Now, I told you last time that we were going to be seeing something interesting near the temple. And this is it. This is apparently a burial chamber for the chief engineer, Senenmut. Our guide, Midu, a Christian man guiding us in Egypt, he's a native Egyptian, had his master's degree in ancient Egyptology so he could read the hieroglyphics, has done much research into all of this. And he contended that the person building a temple for a pharaoh would have, the job most likely would have fallen to the pharaoh's son. Well, who was Hatshepsut's son? Let's see. Who was it? Oh, Moses. That's right. And that this may have been a different name used by Moses, but that Moses would have been the one constructing the site and thereby having a burial chamber nearby for himself. I don't know if that's true or even likely, but it's interesting nonetheless. This could have been meant for Moses. Hatshepsut did a lot of building of things for herself. One of them was this obelisk that is found in a distance quite a ways from the temple that she built. This is in a temple where a lot of things from different pharaohs found themselves. But as you look at this obelisk standing way up into the sky like that, you can see the hieroglyphics on it. And we take another look in, you see that there is something different about this particular hieroglyphic. Take one more look, and we see that that is a cartouche. Remember that I told you before that a cartouche, a circle around a name, indicates that it's the name of a pharaoh. And so Hatshepsut had this obelisk erected with her name on it and circled as the pharaoh. Getting those to stand erect was a marvelous feat of engineering. Even considering how tall these were and getting them to stand up is something that it's hard to imagine how they were able to do it, to stand it up straight, and the fact that it has not moved in thousands of years. It's still there. Amazing. One of the other statues that Hatshepsut made of herself was in the form of a sphinx, which is located in Memphis, which off and on through Egyptian history was the capital city. This particular area in Memphis is a place where they gathered a number of the statues that had been in that region. And you can see there are booths along the one side there with people trying to sell different artifacts. Well, let's go back to Moses. Remember that Moses is a descendant of Abram through Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Jacob's third son, Kohath, Amram, and then Moses and Aaron are brothers. Now, you remember that when Moses was in Egypt, living in Pharaoh's palace, and boy, that has a lot to think about in itself. Think about the fact that Moses, this Hebrew child, was brought up in the household of Pharaoh in the palace, where he learned everything that an Egyptian royal boy would learn. So he was right up there. In fact, I'm going to suggest that he may have been next in line to be Pharaoh had the following events not occurred. And we know that from the book of Exodus that, that Moses saw an Egyptian overseer beating one of the Hebrew slaves one day, and that just set him off. And so Moses then killed that man and hid him in the sand. You know also that the next day, Moses saw a couple of Hebrews arguing and tried to break it up, and one of them apparently had seen what Moses had done previously and suggested that he would not be able to kill one of them. So Moses murdered an Egyptian overseer, and we know that he escaped to Midian. We'll have more to say about that later. And there he married Zipporah, the daughter of the man that took him in and for whom he worked. And you know it's in that location in the land of Midian that he experiences the burning bush. All right, now we're going to have to go back and forth a little bit because things are happening back in Egypt as well. And by the way, I'm going to suggest that Hatshepsut would have died by this time. There are different dates given for her death and different dates for Moses fleeing that are really close together. Some speculate that she may have been, in fact, murdered by her stepson, Thutmose III. But I think she would have at least been dead by this time, because had she been alive, I don't believe Moses would have had to have fled. Because remember, Moses is son of the Pharaoh. And what can the son of the Pharaoh not do? Even murdering an Egyptian overseer, I don't think would have been something that would have been of concern. So it seems to me logical, at least, to think that Hatshepsut died, and following that, her stepson/nephew, Thutmose III, takes over. And it's in that context that Moses murders this Egyptian and has to flee for his life because he no longer is under the protection of Hatshepsut. In fact, not only is he not under the protection of Hatshepsut, but we know historically that Thutmose III hated Hatshepsut. And you can imagine why. He hated her and her dominance over him because she would not allow him to take over the rulership of Egypt. And when she died, he took over and hated her so much that he had her name removed from public works. For example, any temples, anything that had her name on it, he tried to erase. He didn't get them all. This not only was a means by which he would erase her memory from the people of Egypt, but it also meant that her soul was erased from the afterlife. So this had grave consequences in the minds of Egyptians, at least. Now, Thutmose III hated Hatshepsut, and we can assume by that he also hated her son Moses, because Moses was, in at least some respects, a rival to the throne, given the right circumstances. And so Moses has to flee for his life. Thutmose III was an ambitious person. He was energetic. He participated in 17 military campaigns in 19 years. All that's going after it. There's an interesting story about how the city of Joppa was captured by soldiers who hid in 200 baskets that were brought into the city on a ruse. This probably happened on Thutmose III's first campaign in ancient Egypt. So it's very similar to the Trojan horse idea that these soldiers were smuggled in baskets. Thutmose III is credited with establishing the first professional army. That is, an army not made up of farmers, artisans, whatever, but one that trains and is composed of the same people all the time. He was able to defeat a Syrian Palestinian army at Megiddo in 1479 BC. Megiddo, if you can maybe focus in on the map there, we can see that Megiddo is to north of what would be considered Israel, a Canaanite city. It's the plain from which we get the term Armageddon, the Valley of Megiddo. So it's a location where a lot of battles have been fought over the centuries. Oops, I thought I had that up there, sorry. I'm behind a slide. There we go. Now you can see Megiddo. Thutmose and his troops crossed the 160-mile waste of the Sinai Desert in 9 days, and then proceeded up the coast to a point opposite the pass leading to the city of Megiddo, where the armies of all the important states of northern Palestine and Syria were assembled. He then called a council of officers to find out what they had in mind. There were 3 roads leading into Megiddo, only one of which was direct, but narrow and guarded at the other end. Thutmose told them that they could do as they had suggested and take the 2 indirect routes, but they could follow him instead through the direct pass, which was somewhat problematic. Having begun in the early morning, the first Egyptians emerged from the pass by about 1 p.m., with the rest of the troops still in the pass. But the defenders failed to attack. They should have attacked them when they were in this narrow passage, but they didn't. When all had arrived, the Egyptian army attacked, sending the enemy line running headlong for the city, leaving horses and chariots of gold and silver. The gates had been closed, and the demoralized enemy had to be pulled over the wall by means of clothing that was lowered for them. So they closed the gates. All the soldiers couldn't get back, so they hung clothing down and pulled them up. Thutmose became upset when his soldiers stopped to plunder rather than capture the city. In rebuke, he said to them, "Had you captured this city afterward, behold, I would have given many offerings to Re this day, because every chief of every country that is revolted is within it, and because it is the capture of 1,000 cities, this capture of Megiddo." Well, the city was then surrounded by earth and cut trees, and they laid siege to it. After about 5 months, the city opened its gates and surrendered. The spoils of the city included 924 chariots, over 2,000 horses, 200 suits of armor, 500 bows, the beautiful tent and rich household furnishings of the king of Kadesh, who was the ringleader of all this, large quantities of gold and silver, thousands of head of cattle, and the harvest of the nearby fields. So this was a major victory for Thutmose III. He extended his territory all the way over to the Euphrates River and south into Nubia, which in the Bible is called Cush. He engaged in numerous building projects using a large slave labor force, including a store city later known as Pi Ramesses. A picture from the tomb of his vizier, Rekhmire, shows this. This is the tomb of Rekhmire, the vizier in Thebes, and possibly shows us Hebrews making bricks for that city, which in the Bible is divided between Ramses and another Pi Ramesses, maybe a combination of the two. During this rule of Thutmose III, the priests gained power and wealth, and a new middle class developed of scribes and petty officials. This Pharaoh died as described in Exodus 2, 23 to 25. Which then brings us to the next ruler of Egypt, the all-important Amenhotep II, sometimes called Amenophis II. Again, notice the Amen in his name. During his reign, there is a topographical list that has been found that includes the lands of Canaan. And he, I believe, is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, not Ramesses II. I know almost every TV show and every movie you've seen says Ramesses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. In the Ten Commandments, you can hear him say, Moses, but it's not him. The reason why people have gravitated toward Ramesses II is, one, he was a great builder, and secondly, I think it's because one of the cities that Exodus tells us, that Moses tells us there that the Hebrews were building was a city of Ramses. And so they conclude that therefore the Pharaoh's name must have been Ramses. But more recent scholarship has found that the name Ramses, even though it doesn't appear in the record of pharaohs up until later than this, was a name that was used as kind of a nickname for pharaohs. So the city of Ramses could have been called that prior to Ramses II, simply because it was a common name for pharaohs. Or it could have been something which was anachronistic. That is, a later editor of Exodus put that name in there as the name of the city that was then what it was not before. Either way, I'm not bothered by it. I think the biblical record is accurate, and all explanations aside. But at any rate, I don't believe Ramses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And I think as you see things fitting together, hopefully you'll come to agree with me. The Pharaoh of the Exodus occurred, I believe, at 1447 BC. We can arrive at this date from using what we were given in 1 Kings 6:1, where it says, "Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month that he began to build the house of the Lord. Well, 966 BC was the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Add that, the 480 years from the Exodus brings us to 1446 BC. 1447 is when the plagues would have occurred, which is a much earlier date than many scholars believe, which puts it in the time of Ramses II. More information about Ramses. It was one of the titles belonging to rulers of the Delta and the island of Crete. They were called Ramses. This title was used by these rulers long before the Pharaoh Ramses II, Ramses the Great, and can be found mentioned in the book of Sothis by Syncellus. The Egyptian historian Manetho does not mention them because their seat of government was on Crete. See, Egypt controlled Crete at that time. And so the name stuck there and made it into the personal property of the pharaohs after that. And it was this land, the Delta and possibly even Crete, that were given to the father and brothers of Joseph. All right, the creator of all things among the gods of Egypt was either Re, sometimes called Ra, Amun, Ptah, Khnum, or Aten, depending on which version of the myth was currently in use. The heavens were represented by different gods, the earth god, the flooding of the Nile, storms, the moon, the sun god took on many forms. So many different gods were worshipped in different areas. Local cities or villages often had unique gods that were only known to that region. On occasion, these gods attained countrywide recognition and became the myths and legends that were passed on from century to century. But there were many, many gods and worshipped for many different reasons, mostly because of what that god could do. That plays in then to what we're going to be looking at as we examine the plagues that God brought upon Egypt. As you remember, Moses arrived at Egypt, coming to Pharaoh, Amenhotep II, who is the son of the man that hated Moses so much. I can't imagine he didn't pass some of that down, because Moses is able to walk right in to the palace. No commoner could do that, you would think. So he is still known there, and he comes in and makes the demand that Pharaoh let the people of Israel go. Now, the first miracle that's performed, where Moses is showing the authority of Yahweh, because remember, Pharaoh said, "Who's Yahweh that I should listen to him?" And so Moses throws down his staff, and it turns into a snake. Do you remember what happened next? Yeah, the conjurers of the Egyptian court threw down their staffs, and they became snakes too. Pharaoh thought, okay, we can do it too, so what? But then what happened? Moses' snake ate their snakes, and then Moses grabbed it, turned back into a staff again. Now who's on top? Who's the better? So that's the beginning of the miracles that are performed for Pharaoh as Moses has come to get the people of Israel released. And God had said to Moses that there was going to be judgment. He said, "Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment." So when we look at the plagues, we can be certain of the fact that these are directed specifically at the gods of Egypt. And we'll see how that relates to each plague as we go along. Most of the plagues were not unusual occurrences in Egypt, but they were proved to be supernatural by their intensity, succession, and subjugation to Moses' command, and by the exemption of Israel from 7 of them. After the second plague, the magicians of Egypt failed to imitate Moses' miracles. So here are the 10 plagues. Memorize it. I'll be sending you a quiz. No. And some of the words are different depending on what version, translation that you read. But we have the plague of blood, frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and then, of course, the famous slaying of the firstborn. As I said, these were directed against the Egyptian gods. Among whom the most important were Ammon, who we've talked about quite extensively, the gods Isis and Horus, and the story of Horus being the child of Isis, one of the most popular and famous goddesses of the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Isis is the wife of Osiris, mother of Horus. And this gave birth, no pun intended, to a long line of goddesses with child idea. For example, you've got Isis with Horus, and then you've got Semiramis and Tammuz over in Babylon. We have Inanna, the queen of heaven in Sumer. In Assyria, Ishtar has Bacchus, winged and wearing a version of the horned cap of divinity. In Asia, Cybele has a child which is not seen in the statue because it's been broken away. In Greece, Aphrodite has Eros. In Rome, Venus has Cupid, which then turns into Mary has Jesus. Notice the crown on Mary? It's a continuation of what began in Egypt. Here's a few others and a few of the same, showing how prevalent the idea of mother and child as goddess and son has been throughout history. All right, thought you'd be interested in that. Let's look at the first of the plagues. We're not going to get through all of them today, but we'll get a start. First of all, the Nile River was turned into blood. Now, which god would that be against? I know you don't know the gods. You'd have to have a list in front of you. So I'll tell you. It's against Osiris. Osiris was the god of the Nile, which gave life to Egypt. Now it brought death to the people. The Nile was considered the life veins, the blood veins of Osiris. And God seems to be saying, you believe that the Nile River is the blood of your God? Okay, we'll make it blood. Another god was Hapi, also the god of the Nile. Let's take a brief break here to look at the Egyptian myth of Osiris. According to mythology, he was murdered by his jealous brother, who hacked his body into pieces and scattered them in the Nile. His wife, Isis, reassembled the pieces, and he was magically restored and went on to become the god of the afterlife. And then Hapi was the god of the Nile. The Egyptians who lived in the Nile Valley worshipped Hapi more than they worshipped Ra. So here's the beginning of our plagues. The first plague, the turning of the Nile River into blood, which was mocking at least Osiris and maybe Hapi as well. So God, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrew people, is assaulting the gods of Egypt one by one and demonstrating that He alone is the Amen, the true God. Come back next week and we'll go through the rest of the plagues and see how they relate to the gods of Egypt.